I'm Wrecker Rick, and you're watching Murphy's Diesel, and we're in Wilcox, Arizona, folks.
There's a man in the Arizona desert who has pulled over 1,000 vehicles from places they were never supposed to be, and the cameras captured most of it. Audiences watched him drag semi-trucks out of frozen ditches at 2 in the morning, crawl into the wreckage of other people's worst days, and show up when 14 other companies had already walked away. What those audiences never saw was what happened after the camera turned off. The silence in a cold truck cab, the trembling hands nobody filmed, the calls that came not from stranded strangers on Interstate 40, but from his own terrified family. This is the real story of Wrecker Rick Murphy, and it runs far deeper, far more painful, and far more human than anything his most watched videos have ever managed to show. Rick Murphy and his wife Nikki built Murphy's Diesel from almost nothing in Kingman, Arizona in 2014, with no investors waiting in the background, no financial cushion to absorb early losses, and no guarantee that a single customer would walk through the door. What they carried into that first year was deep mechanical knowledge, a reputation built on personal character alone, and a shared willingness to bet everything on something unproven. For nearly 3 years, a toy hauler trailer served as their home, a cramped space where privacy barely existed and comfort was something other people had. Every dollar that came through the diesel repair shop went right back into keeping it alive, into tools and parts and rent and equipment, because survival was the only item on the budget that mattered. Those early years planted something in Rick that would shape every decision that followed. The habit of operating without a safety net. Established shops in the Kingman area already had loyal customers and stronger financial footing, while some openly questioned whether the Murphys could last, and Rick answered every doubt the same way. Longer hours, more calls answered, more jobs accepted, one customer at a time. What nobody fully recognized at the time was that this pattern wasn't just building a business, it was building a version of himself that couldn't say no, and that version would follow him for the rest of his career. The financial pressure never lifted, even as revenue climbed, and one of the least visible burdens in the Murphy's Diesel story was the growing gap between work completed and payment received. Insurance companies moved at their own pace, while paperwork stacked up and claims sat in queues, all while the shop's bills arrived right on schedule. Unpaid invoices reportedly climbed toward $500,000 at one point, and that number lived in payroll meetings, in quiet conversations about whether a piece of equipment could hold off repairs another month, in the constant mental arithmetic of whether the business was genuinely growing or simply surviving at a higher altitude. Employees needed wages on a fixed schedule, fuel prices shifted without warning, and insurance premiums on heavy recovery work left little room for error. Rick kept accepting jobs because each completed recovery invested further in the company's name, and the reputation he'd built from scratch was the only currency he trusted completely. The shift from diesel repair shop to serious heavy recovery operation changed everything about Murphy's Diesel, and at the center of that shift sat Hellboy, a heavily modified 1969 Peterbilt built to go where ordinary trucks couldn't and pull what ordinary equipment couldn't touch. Investing in that truck was among the boldest financial decisions Rick ever made, opening doors to recoveries nobody else would attempt while introducing a category of ongoing expense that never went away. Maintenance on a machine like Hellboy runs constant and costly, and one serious mechanical failure at the wrong moment could erase months of margin. The phone started ringing with calls that matched the machine. Overturned semi-trucks, vehicles buried in off-road terrain, crashes during severe weather, jobs so dangerous that other operators declined before finishing the details. Rick Murphy became the name you called when every other option had already told you no. By 2017, Murphy's Diesel had grown to multiple locations and secured contracts connected to law enforcement for clearing accidents on Interstate 40 in Arizona. These were real emergencies involving overturned big rigs, spilled cargo, closed lanes, and families stranded on the shoulder while Rick and his crew worked to restore order to scenes that had none. Authorities called Murphy's Diesel because they needed the job done correctly and quickly, and every successful clearance added another layer of credibility to a name that had started with almost nothing. But credibility arrives with its own weight attached, and the more indispensable Rick became, the harder it grew to create any distance between himself and the work. YouTube found him around the same time, with audiences drawn in by footage of Hellboy doing things that pushed past what heavy recovery equipment could reasonably accomplish. Clips spread, view counts climbed, and people who had never been to Arizona found themselves watching recovery videos well into the night. Hundreds of thousands of subscribers arrived, some videos reached millions of views, and Murphy's Diesel transformed from a regional Arizona service into something with national recognition. But online visibility created something Rick hadn't anticipated. An image, and when you become the person who says yes to everything and pulls off the impossible on camera, people begin to believe that's the whole story. The exhausted man climbing back into the truck after 18 hours with numbers in his head that don't quite add up, that version never trends. Nikki's role deserves far more than a footnote, because while Rick was on the road, she held the architecture of Murphy's Diesel together from the inside. Coordinating schedules, managing calls, tracking jobs, handling paperwork, keeping the operational side from collapsing under the weight of its own growth. The boundary between their professional and personal lives was never really a boundary at all. Phones rang during family meals, plans evaporated when a call came in that couldn't be delayed, and evenings were interrupted by the next dispatch. Over time, this stopped feeling like an inconvenience and settled into something that just was, and the erosion was gradual enough to miss until it had already reshaped everything around it. Then came the events that made the abstract costs of this life suddenly, terrifyingly concrete. February 2024 brought dense fog settling over Interstate 40, and Nikki was driving with their daughter Indy when visibility dropped and a truck appeared ahead with no warning and no room to react. She steered off the roadway into a ditch in a decision made in seconds that almost certainly prevented something far worse. Both she and Indy survived, but Rick was not there. He received the phone call instead. A man whose entire professional identity is built on assessing situations and acting on them suddenly reduced to waiting with nothing to do but listen. The accident didn't take his family, but it claimed something else. Some version of the belief that the danger surrounding his professional life stayed neatly on the job site. A year later, in February 2025, another scare arrived, with a trip in an older 1981 diesel vehicle turning dangerous in ways Rick later described as the most frightening call he had ever received. 2 events in 2 years, each one a sharp reminder that the risk he had normalized at recovery scenes wasn't contained to recovery scenes. It followed his family onto ordinary roads, in ordinary vehicles, during trips that were supposed to be completely unremarkable. 1 close call can be filed under bad luck, but 2 begin to feel like a pattern, and patterns settle permanently into how a person understands the world. March 2025 brought the snowstorm, with northern Arizona receiving over 2 feet of snow in a compressed window of time, burying secondary roads near Ash Fork and stranding drivers who had badly underestimated what was coming. What started as a standard emergency deployment stretched across roughly 40 hours of continuous operation, pulling vehicles back onto passable roads, helping drivers who had run low on fuel, clearing paths through snow that made every maneuver more dangerous. Nearly 30 drivers received assistance during that stretch, many without charge. None of that changes the arithmetic of what 40 hours means physically. Reaction time slows, judgment becomes harder to maintain, and the margin between a clean recovery and a catastrophic one gets thinner with every hour of lost sleep. Rick understood all of this and kept going anyway, because people were stuck on frozen Arizona roads and he was the one who could reach them. What the snowstorm left behind was a question not about capability, but about sustainability. Generosity, repeated often enough, stops being recognized as a decision and starts being treated as an obligation, and saying no carried a cost for Rick that went beyond the practical. His name was built on showing up, and not showing up felt like a betrayal of everything Murphy's Diesel stood for. The full shape of the trap becomes visible right there. Rick Murphy isn't held in place by failure. He never collapsed under the early pressure, never let the reported $500,000 in unpaid invoices break the business, never walked away when conditions pushed past what anyone could reasonably manage. He's held in place by success, by the structures his own persistence built around him across more than a decade of heavy recovery work. Employees depend on Murphy's Diesel for their income. Communities depend on it during genuine emergencies. Law enforcement trusts the operation to perform under pressure, and customers identify Rick personally as the standard of reliability. Every one of those dependencies is the direct result of choices he made intentionally, choices that were right and honorable, and together they form walls he cannot easily walk through without dismantling something that matters to real people. Stepping back isn't a simple scheduling adjustment. It would require renegotiating every promise, spoken and unspoken, that Rick has ever made to everyone who depended on him. The same qualities that make him exceptional at his work, the refusal to quit, the willingness to absorb difficulty, the compulsion to show up regardless of conditions, are the exact qualities that make stopping nearly impossible. Comment sections fill with admiration, subscriber counts climb, people share the clips and say there's someone who really shows up. And they're right, but they rarely ask what showing up every single time, without exception, across years of this, actually costs the person doing it. Nikki has lived alongside this reality in a way no viewer can appreciate from the outside, holding her breath on the other end of a phone line more times than anyone should have to, knowing exactly how fast things deteriorate on a highway at night in bad weather, because she has seen the aftermath more closely than most people ever will. The emotional weight of a household shaped by constant, undischargeable responsibility doesn't show up in a thumbnail. It builds slowly, expressing itself in small, accumulated moments. A dinner interrupted, a plan canceled, a night where sleep won't come because the mind keeps turning over what almost happened on Interstate 40 in the fog. Rick Murphy built something real from nothing, against doubt, through sacrifice that most people would have considered sufficient reason to stop long before he did. Murphy's diesel stands as proof of what sustained commitment in the heavy recovery industry can produce, and that's exactly what makes his story genuinely difficult to sit with. The trucks he pulls from ditches along Arizona highways are, in a quiet and uncomfortable way, a kind of mirror. They arrived in their position through circumstances that accumulated over time, through external force and difficult terrain, until one day they were somewhere they couldn't escape without help. Rick has spent his entire career being that help, and the harder question, the one his recent reflections seem to be slowly circling, is who plays that role for him. The man who drives Hellboy into situations everyone else avoids still feels the cold, still carries the memory of every call that came close to going a different way, and still goes home to a family that needs him in ways the dispatch line cannot override. The hope is straightforward, that the man who has spent years pulling others back to solid ground can finally find a way to secure his own.